Hi, I'm Angela Fehr. I'm all about teaching you watercolor skills and mindset to help you be your own favorite artist. Today we're going to be painting Wet in Wet, doing an abstract, intuitive watercolor of just channeling some autumn leaves. We're going to use 3 colors. This is a technique you can do with your right or left hand. If you've injured yourself and you feel like you can't paint the way you usually do, this is a really good time to exercise your loose painting. I don't think that anything should hold us back from painting from the heart with fearless, joyful play, and that's what we're going to do in this tutorial today. I always link up supplies that I'm using down below the video. We're going to start with a little bit of Quinacridone Gold Deep and let it flow. Look at that. Color is flowing really well because I ran my paper. This is 140 pound indigo art paper. It's 100% cotton. And I ran this paper underwater for a few seconds on both sides before I put it on this board, and because it's wet on the back side, it actually stays, kind of suctions itself down to the board. Now I have a spot here that's not flowing very well. You can see that it's just not as wet as everything else. I'm going to moisten it with my spray bottle. I'm actually going to add a little water underneath as well, and that's going to help it kind of stick and stay in place. When you wet your paper down like this, it stays wet for a really long time, so we have lots of time to play with Wet in Wet painting. And I'm thinking autumn leaves. I'm sure you can tell. It's got that beautiful warmth to it. And we're thinking big shapes. And anytime you're painting Wet in Wet, you really want to focus on getting in those large masses of shape rather than thinking about the details right away. Right now, we actually have an uneven amount of moisture on the paper. Running it under the sink was all fine and good, but some parts, if I tilt my board, then it's going to be a little wetter down here. Up here, it's a little drier. So I can see different effects happen depending on where I touch my brush to the paper. Here it's really fluid, really wet. Things are really going to move. Over on this side, it's a little drier, so my color stays a little more where it's put. And that's the magic of this style of Wet in Wet painting, is starting to work with different levels of fluidity on your paper, and that's where we get our shape and our contrast. And I'll demonstrate that as this painting develops. Right now, again, strong saturation of pigment here, lots of movement pushing out and diluting the paint in here. I feel like I'm calling a sporting event or something. We've got movement over here. We're going to add a little bit of Cobalt Teal, and I love Cobalt Teal because it's, for one reason, is that I'm putting a complementary color. It's a turquoise, it's a blue that pairs really well with the orange, and it really has this beautiful identity. Cobalt Teal, it goes with everything. And I dare you to find a color that Cobalt Teal doesn't mix well with. You're not going to find one. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And this is Cobalt Teal made by Core. And so it loves to move in that wet paint as well. So I can add some water here, or add some paint rather, and let it flow. Make sure as you're painting, when you go into your palette, you want to be picking up a nice saturation of pigment. If your paint is really, really dry, you might need to spend a little time just kind of stroking your brush on that pigment so that you get a lot of pigment on your brush. The more pigment you have, the longer you can paint and the more brilliant of colors that you can place on your paper. Right now I'm seeing a lot of moisture just bleeding off the edge of the paper. I like to catch some of that and just blot it. I've got a bubble of liquid right at the edge, which I can lift as well. Okay, so there's some unpredictability going on here. Now we can look at this and actually be able to tell what's wet and what's starting to dry a little bit faster. Look at this trail of kind of blended color in the middle. That shows us how much fluidity was in this area because it had so much time to flow and move. That also tells me that is the area that's going to take the longest to dry, so that if I start moving my brush, bringing color across that area, it's going to bleed quite a bit. but it's going to bleed less if I move up into here where things are starting to dry a bit more. So I can be aware of that and use that to my advantage as I start to think about placing a few interesting shapes into my painting. Just because we're painting wet and wet doesn't mean everything has to be really amorphous and fluid. We're going to actually start putting some shape into the painting. Over here I see a little leaf coming down. See that? Actually a largish leaf. And so that's kind of nice. And our turquoises are disappearing a bit. Our cobalt teal is really strong right here, washed away quite a bit over here. We have the option to add a little water if we have an area that's too dark. Maybe I decide that I want more fluidity, softness in this area. I can start to add some water and let it flow. And that's going to do a couple of things. It's going to migrate some of that color, some of that pigment down toward the bottom of the page. You can see it pooling down there. So that's going to make this area lighter. It's also going to add some moisture. It's going to mean this area takes longer to dry. So I've actually lightened this area, but it still has a nice softness to it. I didn't have to scrub with my brush. I'm using a very light touch at this stage. I can also maybe try a little bit of that yellow. And that is Hansa Yellow Light. So far I've only used 3 colors. I'm going to keep it at that actually. I'm not going to introduce any new colors into this painting from here. That's not 100% true. I might put a brown in. But I am going to continue going back and forth with those colors. So I can take the Hansa Yellow Light, look for places where I want that glow to happen. I want to keep some of this, I like these shapes that are happening here. So I want to keep my lighter values, I want them to stay light. I don't want them to get too dark. And I want to just continue to build on what I've created here. A really fluid brush stroke right there. You can see it trickling down. If I have my brush loaded with that cobalt teal and less water, it's going to move less, especially depending on where I place that color. These are all just principles of working wet and wet, being observant to the different stages of moisture on the different parts of the paper. Okay, we're going to do something fun. I'm switching brushes. I have this dagger striper. It's from Cheap Joe's Art Stuff. And this is the big one. This is the number 5. And it's damp right now, but it has no paint on it. So if I take that dagger striper and decide to drag it across this drying paint, I'm going to zoom in a little so you can see this, I start to get some lines. So I can actually start to make some tree branches here by using a damp brush and no paint. That dampness will let some of the color flow, but the brush is also not drippy damp. It actually will lift color a bit as I pull it across the paper. So I can lift out some branch shapes and create some texture that way. I can also add water and place some shapes and create texture that way. And I can take the Quinacridone gold and pull some across the paper as it's starting to dry and create some shapes that way. And we start to get this really beautiful webbing of color that happens with the varying techniques that I'm using. Look how beautiful that is. Over here I can paint a darker stroke. And I'm using not just the point of the brush, but the side of it too, to create lines that are wide and narrow both. And they have variety. So I'm layering a darker color over that lifted lighter branch. And you can just see how that brings that painting to life. Suddenly I have shapes emerging, interesting depths, and it's really quite beautiful. Now we could get courageous and try using a little bit of the cobalt teal And I haven't even cleaned my brush. I'm just dipping it in the Cobalt Teal. Might have a little bit of the Quinacridone Deep Gold as well. Residue on there, and that's okay. And as I keep building up, lifting out color as well as placing color, you can see the beautiful kind of mystical feeling that it creates. I can decide as well to use paper towel. I like using the paper towel for this leaf demonstration because I can actually use it to lift out some kind of leafy shapes. Just by changing my angle, turning a bit, creating some lighter areas. They're like ghost leaves, really fun. Now, there's this big white line kind of down the center, and I don't really love that. It feels a little too much like something kind of splitting my painting in half. So that means I want to find strategies for helping it to kind of disappear. So I'm going to use the Quinacridone Gold to kind of carry that color across the page. I think that will work the best and create a subtle effect, especially if I blend it with some other techniques. So look at how just creating those lines carries my painting from one side to the other. I'm going to be really courageous because that's an instructor's job, to do the brave things the rest of us are afraid to do. I'm going to take some of this Cobalt Teal. Cobalt Teal has some opacity to it. That's why I can paint it over that darker Quin Gold and still see it. It does keep stand out just a little bit because it's not quite as transparent as the most transparent watercolor. It's got a little opacity to it. Let's do some kind of feathery lines. As things are slowly drying, I'm getting the chance to create line that's a bit soft, a bit ethereal, but also does get to keep its own identity. Let's put a big leaf right there. I'd love to hear how you feel about wet and wet painting. Leave a comment below. Tell me what your biggest struggle in watercolor is, and maybe I'll feature you in a future video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel because I do share watercolor tutorials that will help you grow as an artist and become your own favorite artist. And then let's put another one here, and then we'll feel like the wind is blowing our leaves across the paper. And now they all look the same size, so let's make some a little irregular. There's so much you can do with something like this, just back and forth, lifting color to change up. What I've done is a lot here is I've changed up the tension on the paper so it's not evenly wet where everything would run together in an even way. We've got areas where I blotted with the paper towel, and that lifted the moisture so that brush strokes that are placed over that area stay a little more crisp. In other areas, the brush strokes dissolve and flow away. And so we get this beautiful variety. We don't just place paint on our paper, we also lift paint off the paper. And that again gives us that beautiful transition and variety that makes our painting interesting and beautiful. As it dries, I might decide later that I want to push those values a little darker. I can go over this with more layers of paint and add more further detail. Although I think there's something really magical about the dance of the colors and the way the paint flows softly and crisply here in this wet and wet study. One thing I'll do as I wait for it to dry is I will remove it from the board so that it can dry a little bit faster. You can see a lot of water underneath there where it kind of suctioned onto the board. And so I might just leave it on this absorbent mat to dry, or I could choose to prop it up somewhere if I feel like it's not going to flow a lot. And that way you get air at both sides and it will dry just a little bit faster. If I had puddles of moisture pooling around the edges of my paper, I would I wouldn't walk away. I would plan to blot any of those puddles because they might push back into the wash and create back runs. Right now, I'm at a really good stage for letting things dry because I don't have I don't see fluidity happening as I tilt. I don't see the color starting to run. So I know that what's happening here, while it will keep evolving and changing as it dries, it's probably not going to change in a dramatic way and create big monstrous blooms or anything like that. And I can come back and take a look at the finished product after it's completely dried in a few hours.